Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, February 7. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief webcast. He is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC, that owns the Times News organization. He has led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives for the Universal Peace Federation to Northeast Asia and the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you all for all that you do for the Washington Brief and the Washington Times Foundation. I want to welcome our audiences coming from throughout America and Europe and Asia. We're very happy to present this monthly program on insights into Northeast Asia. Today, we're looking at the Korean Peninsula and a strategic outlook. Our moderator for our program is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, a commentator on security issues. Formerly, he was the special envoy for negotiations with North Korea and the director of National Counterproliferation Center and associate director of national intelligence. Also, our panelist is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov. Dr. Mansourov is an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington. He is also an adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Our guest panelist today is Mr. Markus Garlauskas. Mr. Garlauskas was recently named director of the new Indo-Pacific Security Initiative of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council and is an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University's Security Studies program. He served nearly 20 years in U.S. government dealing with North Korea, most recently as a senior official leading strategic intelligence analysis of North Korea after serving as chief strategist for the U.S. Forces Korea. I'd like to turn this over to our moderator, Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Michael. And I think this will be a great discussion today. Let me just sort of set the scene. Over the last few days, we've seen significant dialogue coming out of North Korea, where their Ministry of Foreign Affairs has reacted to the joint statement coming out of South Korea and the United States about enhancing deterrence, enhancing joint military exercises, where the North Korean government has said, this is an extreme crossing of the red line, and they will respond with overwhelming nuclear force if they see this continuation on enhancement of joint military exercises between the United States and the Republic of Korea. We've seen Secretary of State Austin's successful visit to the Philippines, where the Philippines government has agreed to 4 additional U.S. bases in the Philippines, which is significant. Secretary Blinken will be visiting China next week, and we've heard a lot about China's negative growth, where the population is not increasing in China, and how that would affect the demographics. So much going on, and indeed, in next year we'll be looking at an election in Taiwan. We're saying Wen would not be running again. She's into a second term, and there will be a significant election. So there's so much going on in regards to North Korea, but the region itself and beyond, with the U.S. looking at very closely and working with our allies, looking at closely the second year of the war in Ukraine, how tragic that is. So over to you. We're very fortunate to have our colleague today, Garlauskas. This Marcus is a man who knows North Korea better than anyone else I know. So we're so fortunate. Marcus, over to you.
Joe, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. So you raised a lot of important current events that underscore some overall strategic trends that I'd like to talk about today. So what I've found, as you know, in my time as a national intelligence officer, and you know that role well, is that it's difficult to get people to step back and think about the larger strategic picture when there are so many events going on that demand our attention and that certainly are significant. And so today, what I'd like to do is look a little bit further out at the arc, the trajectory upon which we're headed. And so I think, for example, when North Korea conducts a weapons test, or when you see this rhetoric, coming out of Pyongyang, it's very understandable to be concerned and to apply your focus there. But it's important, I think, to look at how these events fit into a larger context and a larger, if you'll excuse this pun, trajectory of events. And so at the same time, I think there's also this tendency for people to have their attention sort of deadened, and perhaps even those people who are not as focused on North Korea just see some of these headlines and say, oh, there it is, North Korea's at it again, this is the same old stuff. And I would argue, actually, if again you step back and look at the big picture, that events overall in past years and in years to come are on a very dangerous path. And I do think that some of the steps that are being taken by the alliance to shore up deterrence are certainly very important. But I think we have to really come to grips with the fact that the nature of the deterrence challenge on the Korean Peninsula and in East Asia is fundamentally changing. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So first, let me focus on the challenge that North Korea poses to deterrence and how that's changing. And one of the things that we have to confront is the fact that there is this bias to consider the Korean Peninsula as a really prime example of the effectiveness of U.S. extended deterrence guarantees and of deterrence in general. And that leads a lot of people then to be a bit complacent about deterrence and focus more on simply reassuring our allies that deterrence is going to hold, and not quite as much on thinking about what do we need to do differently than what we've done in the past to be able to deter aggression by North Korea. And deterrence, of course, has been the watchword on the Korean Peninsula since the armistice of 1953. And again, looking backward, there has been a great deal of success. Though North Korea has had its threatening rhetoric, its saber rattling, development of weapons in defiance of UN resolutions, and even some occasional acts of very severe but limited violence. In the end, deterrence of a major attack has held firm for nearly seven decades now. And so there's some who might question whether or not a nuclear-armed North Korea led by Kim Jong-un can reliably be deterred at all. And certainly this was a question that was really at the forefront of a lot of discussion in the 2017 period, the so-called Fire and Fury period. The general consensus among the national security experts and the political leaders alike seems to be that deterrence will continue to hold in Korea, and that we can continue to use the same techniques we have in the past to maintain that deterrence. And so as a result, when you look at the efforts to really rethink the deterrence as opposed to make adjustments, and where the risk is really focused, there's a lot of focus on the deterrence in the Taiwan Strait, deterrence of Chinese aggression, and then of course the near-term challenge of Russian aggression in Ukraine and the risk of nuclear escalation by Russia. Those are also gathering a lot of attention. And so I'm very happy to see Secretary Austin's visit and the focus on deterrence. But this is really in the Korean Peninsula. But this has really been the exception rather than the norm, to have Korea really be in the forefront of a deterrence conversation, of the need to really enhance it and refocus it. And that's the nature of the challenge that America faces right now, is a strategic simultaneity, that we have three different potential adversaries here that are armed with nuclear weapons, and it is a challenge for the United States to be able to focus on them simultaneously and deal with them simultaneously. It's a challenge that we can overcome, but in the case of Korea, I think it's one that definitely may be underestimated by people both inside and outside of the focus of the community of North Korea experts, government and non-government. So in comparison to the overall power of Russia and China, and of course the ambiguity of the nature of our commitments to Taiwan and Ukraine, where we don't have a clear mutual defense treaty with either of those countries. The situation in Korea seems very clear-cut. We have a mutual defense treaty with the Republic of Korea, and then of course, North Korea is this destitute country with half the population and a tiny fraction of the wealth of the Republic of Korea that it threatens. And it's hard to consider at first glance why North Korea would not be deterred from serious escalation against South Korea. So, given that Pyongyang just seems so vastly outmatched, as long as Washington or Seoul don't start a conflict, the conventional wisdom is that Pyongyang would not dare to risk war or to use nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future. And as with many elements of conventional wisdom, the logic of this premise, it's simple, its implications are comforting, and it's hard to disprove. But this conventional wisdom could prove wrong. It could prove disastrously wrong. And upon some serious examination, the confidence that we have in the strength of deterrence in Korea and the prospects for it in the future is based in many ways on a backward look at some longstanding assumptions that are no longer tenable and political military conditions that have already begun to shift and are likely to change even more dramatically in the next few years out to a decade. So as a result, when you see people think about deterrence, even when they're examining it in depth, there's oftentimes the tendency to look at how are we shoring it up against erosion rather than the need to fundamentally relook that it's a different situation. And this is what concerns me and why we really need to draw attention to it. This isn't about just a little bit of a moving the needle or trying to again shore things up, maybe just repair some cracks. It needs, I think, a more fundamental degree of attention. So of all the potential scenarios, though, for deterrence failure, I do want to emphasize a decision by the North Koreans to seize an opportunity to launch a full-scale attack to reunify the peninsula. That's one of the least plausible scenarios. And so if we're talking just about deterring that sort of thing, okay, yes, then the challenge is pretty clear-cut, pretty straightforward, and we have a lot of advantages that make it possible to deter that. But in my view, based on my research and consulting with many other people who focus on these issues, the path to strategic deterrence failure in Korea is far more likely to begin with some limited coercive escalation by North Korea that leads to an escalation cycle that causes Pyongyang to double down, to escalate further to try and retake the initiative, which then drives the escalation dynamics that lead North Korea to decide to launch a preemptive or preventive attack, and then also which motivate Beijing to intervene in some way to shield North Korea from the consequences of its actions, and potentially even to directly intervene militarily as the situation escalates. So again, this is not a situation where Pyongyang makes this conscious decision going in that, hey, we are going to launch a full-scale war. It is that they conduct a limited act of aggression where through a series of events, the North Koreans end up getting to the point where they decide continuing to escalate further is their best of perhaps some bad options. And so, here I'm really talking about deterrence. I think another element that we have to consider, and I won't go into this, is the coercive approach of North Korea and how you deal with coercion below the threshold of deterring a major attack. And so there is this tendency in some quarters to look at how do we mollify Pyongyang when they conduct an act of coercion. How do we keep the situation from escalating? How do we find a way to give Pyongyang maybe a little bit of what they want, or to do something to basically restrain ourselves or our allies from strongly responding to what North Korea does. And this is something that's a natural tendency, right? We want to avoid a war in the Korean Peninsula. We want to avoid particularly a nuclear war. But also, this sort of approach has its own risks in that it can incentivize North Korea to keep escalating its coercion and essentially, put you in a situation where you have Pyongyang and Beijing potentially getting overconfident in how far that they can push the envelope. And so over the course of years, that sort of approach is really unsustainable in terms of maintaining deterrence. And that you can't, satisfy, I think, Pyongyang's demands Pyongyang's expectations to the point where they are going to, say, hey, we no longer need to conduct coercion. We no longer are going to push the envelope. It's really not viable, I think, to give North Korea enough of what it wants to the point where it decides that coercion is no longer a viable approach. This is something, again, is a long-term issue, for deterrence in terms of, if you take the short-term approach of, hey, well, we avoided a war this time. The problem is that if that makes a escalation even more likely the next time there's a crisis, then you're ultimately undermining deterrence. So the short-term focus, can be a problem. But looking over the arc of the capabilities that North Korea has developed and where those capabilities are heading, it's important to come to grips with the fact that the North Korean development of more precise and capable conventional options, along with more robust nuclear capabilities, is going to challenge the credibility of a focus on deterrence by punishment in the coming years and coming decade. And in particular, it's going to, in my assessment, increase the level to which North Korea believes it can escalate without triggering a regime-ending response, right? And because it can limit, its military strikes and still achieve some success, but at the same time, it can fall back on that ability to retaliate, in kind or beyond with nuclear capability. So as Pyongyang grows more confident in its own nuclear deterrent and in the likelihood of assertive involvement in Korea by the PRC to counter the U.S.'s arrival, I think Pyongyang's view of its own escalatory options to either press its advantage or to retake the initiative in a crisis, it's going to increase. And then, of course, they're going to have many more diverse options to do that. Another element, and I'll talk a little bit about this more, as we go through this discussion, is that the likelihood of a intervention or interference by the People's Republic of China in a Korea crisis is going to increase. And as PRC military capabilities grow, and as the rivalry between the PRC and the U.S., the strategic rivalry heightens. And right now, the alliance between the Republic of Korea and the United States is really not politically or militarily aligned and postured to focus on deterring or defeating the People's Republic of China. It's focused on, very explicitly, on North Korea. And the problem is that both partners, understandably, seem reluctant to pay the political cost and incur the reactions from Beijing that it would take to realign to confront this growing challenge more directly. And so this is a concern because this could encourage North Korea to acts of adventurism, thinking that then that China looming in the background will restrain and complicate the responses by the alliance. And this is particularly a problem in the Yellow Sea, what the Koreans call the West Sea, the body of water there between the Korean Peninsula and the mainland of China. And so that is a very sensitive space in which the North Koreans historically have conducted provocations, and in which, again, because of the strategic context here, really could be a place where the North Koreans think that they can push the envelope and rely then on implicit, potential for Chinese response or implicit Chinese backing to limit how the alliance responds in those areas. And this is a topic that I've written on for publication before. So that's the nature of the threat and how it's changing from North Korea and the context. But also we have to look very carefully at the alliance and at ourselves and our military posture in the ROK-US alliance, which includes things like the authorities for commanders, the capabilities, the command structure, the readiness training. It hasn't been designed for across a full spectrum of contingencies, right? It hasn't been designed to handle everything down from a very limited provocation up to a full-scale war with North Korea. It's really focused much more on those two high-end possibilities, on preparing for and deterring a full-scale attack by North Korea, and then dealing with a very limited and low-level provocation by North Korea. It's unsuited for a rapid but a limited response to a North Korean limited attack that's short of war but well beyond some of the provocations we've seen. And also, to be fair, it's really not designed to deter or defeat the intervention by the People's Republic of China. And it's certainly, as we're seeing in the discussions in public, there are understandable concerns that it's really not designed for a nuclear warfight, right? The idea that that the alliance would respond in a conflict where North Korea uses a nuclear weapon and fight that conflict to conclusion. The focus is more on either deterring that or basically saying we're going to wipe out the regime if they even use a nuclear weapon, right? And so there's a middle ground that the alliance is really not aligned to deal with, and that it needs to be more visibly prepared in that space, right? So North Korea almost certainly knows that it can't survive if it triggers an all-out nuclear war. But one of the concerns that I have is that it probably sees a greater viability for a limited nuclear use in the year ahead. So particularly a limited nuclear demonstration, or even in the context of a conflict, a limited nuclear strike. And so the most likely scenario for North Korea using a nuclear weapon would be a very limited use that's intended to pose a dilemma and constraint for not only our response, but even for China. And so North Korea's increasing capabilities, the things that they've been developing that would allow them to better conduct a limited nuclear demonstration or a low yield, a tactical nuclear strike, it's going to give North Korea options that could undermine our extended deterrence. And if North Korea executes them, it will have global implications. Even if our response prevents a catastrophic near-term strategic deterrence failure, how we respond to a limited nuclear use by North Korea, or even a nuclear demonstration, say, a nuclear detonation in the atmosphere as part of a missile test, how we respond to that is going to have global implications for our deterrence posture. So the challenges overall, I want to emphasize to deterrence in East Asia have really begun to change fundamentally, and there's some grave growing risks. So another thing that I've alluded to but haven't gone into that I want to conclude with here is the challenges posed by the potential for a conflict with either the People's Republic of China or North Korea to escalate horizontally to become a simultaneous conflict with both of these countries, or the potential for either of both of these countries in the event of a conflict to escalate vertically to a limited nuclear strike, a limited nuclear attack, rather than concede defeat. And so there's this tendency, I think, among many observers to frame the deterrence challenges in East Asia as these two separate problems, either deterring, the PRC, say, aggression, against Taiwan being the best example, or deterring aggression by North Korea. And so this has led to a gap, I think, in the literature, the understanding of how do you deter the other of these two adversaries in the event that there's a conflict with one. So I think, an area that we could really better explore and more focus on is how we posture ourselves to be able to maintain deterrence of the second adversary in East Asia in the event of a conflict with the first. And I think there are opportunities to do this, and particularly to use what has been termed an integrated deterrence approach. So integrating across all the military capabilities, integrating with allies, but of course also integrating across all elements of national power. But I think it's important to keep in mind that if a conflict is initiated by either the People's Republic of China or North Korea, the potential for this to expand to simultaneous conflict with both is going to impose potentially some severe operational and strategic challenges. And even though we're not in a position where we have a crystal ball to say exactly how the situation would play out, there's many plausible pathways from which a conflict with one of these two countries could expand into conflicts with both, even without explicit coordination between Beijing and Pyongyang. And the pathways are sufficiently numerous and they're plausible that if one of these adversaries initiates a conflict and that conflict doesn't conclude quickly, we need to prepare and plan for the potential that a simultaneous conflict with both of these could result. So there's deep distrust between the PRC and North Korea, and neither is going to feel compelled, I think, by any sort of sense of obligation to fight alongside the other. And again, we don't really see the sort of strategic close coordination between Pyongyang and Beijing that would lead you to think they're going to engineer a simultaneous war. And so, but that doesn't mean that the simultaneous conflicts, there's not a lot of other reasons that this could emerge. And so the problem is that a conflict in East Asia has such profound consequences for both Beijing and Pyongyang that they're unlikely to just simply remain spectators in the event that conflict begins, even if they're not initially part of it, they're going to try and shape the outcome to serve their interests. And in particular, the potential for China to see its interests threatened in the event of North Korea being defeated in a military conflict, perhaps North Korea collapsing or getting to the point of using nuclear weapons, could very well lead China to decide to intervene in that scenario. And the North Koreans, again, could play off of that and intentionally trying to encourage that to shape the situation. But then alternately, a conflict in the say the Taiwan Strait between the U.S. And a coalition of the willing in China could very easily escalate to the Korean Peninsula as China looks at all of the U.S. bases and capabilities in the region. Even if China doesn't initially focus on U.S. forces Korea or U.S. bases in Korea, that conflict could very naturally geographically expand. And it's important to keep in mind that the Korean Peninsula is wedged in there between China and Japan, where a lot of allied and U.S. capability would be potentially involved in a Taiwan conflict, and so this means that China is going to have strong incentives if they are not able to say achieve a quick win to expand geographically their aggression against U.S. bases in the region in a way that will put potentially the Korean Peninsula right in the middle of that situation. And certainly there's going to be the concern in Beijing about what's the role that the ROK could potentially play. Could U.S. forces Korea assets either from the peninsula or moving off of the peninsula be used in such a conflict? This is going to be real concern for Beijing. And then of course from the Allied perspective, there's going to be a real concern about might China strike first against USFK or the ROK, or what is it going to mean the outcome for all of the allies of the U.S. in the region, including the Republic of Korea, if China emerges victorious in such a conflict, defeats the United States and seizes Taiwan. So the ROK itself, even though it wants to stay out of a conflict, is going to have real reasons to seriously consider how it could directly or indirectly support Taiwan and the United States to prevent China from achieving this victory that will really increase its leverage in the region and really strain U.S. military capabilities, which the ROK, of course, wants to have that support to deter North Korea. So I feel like I've already gone on a great deal, and you can see the complexity of these challenges. And I wanted to make sure that we leave some time for discussion. And then, of course, I want to reemphasize these are my personal views. They don't represent those of any organization I'm affiliated with now. Of course, my former government role. These are my own personal views, and I really look forward to having a conversation on these issues.
Well, thank you, Markus. That's very insightful. There's so much to unpack in this discussion with you. We're going to look to Alexandre to start the dialogue, and you noted very carefully, but with great insight, the escalatory aspects to conflict with North Korea, of stumbling into accidental warfare, which could escalate into possibly even limited nuclear conflict. And then China being introduced into the equation because China may feel compelled to come to the aid of North Korea for its own reasons. So there's so much to unpack, and we'll open this to discussion with first starting with Alexandre and some comments, Alexandre, and maybe some questions for Markus.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador Markus. Welcome to the program. This is a brilliant presentation. Again, lots of interesting ideas, not easy to digest, but I'll try to highlight some of the points which you made, which kind of drew my attention. And I'll start by talking a little bit about the challenges which you say North Korea poses to deterrence. And that is that bias, inherent bias, that we believe that, the deterrence is working, it's successful, and that leads in a way to complacency and to the loss of vigilance on our part. And that may have very serious implications. Just to give you an example, the Russian-Ukrainian situation. Many Russians believe that the reason, what's happening there is the result of the complacency on the part of the Russian leadership, which thought that they had everything under control. They could intervene any time to deter an anti-Moscow action in Kiev. And basically, they thought they held their finger on the pulse. And yet the situation ran away from them. And once they woke up, they realized that, they lost vigilance. They just missed it. Again, that's one take on the situation. You may disagree, but I'm just trying to say here that losing vigilance because of complacency in the Korean theater could have as dramatic implications as in what we're seeing in Europe right now. Now, that said, should we discount North Korean threats? As you listen to some of the North Korean statements from not the government, but from the former defectors from the North Korean military, in their testimonies before Congress, one of them said, I quote here, Americans believe that even if North Korea possessed the ability to strike the U.S., it would never dare because of the devastating consequences. But he absolutely disagreed with that. He claimed that if North Korea created more than 20,000 American casualties in the region, the U.S. would roll back its presence, and that would give North Korea a chance to win a war. Another defector supplemented that by saying that actually the North Korean military believes that if they carried out a limited nuclear strike, as you indicated, let's say against Camp Humphrey, taking out that strategic asset and causing thousands of deaths on the United States side, that would cause the United States to disengage, and that would open the way for them to win in that limited conflict. So there is a number of scenarios, what North Koreans might envision and how their use of nuclear deterrent, even in a limited fashion, could produce the results, the outcomes which they desire. But I have a couple of specific questions for you, which I think our audience wants to get some answers, some clarifications. And let me start with two questions, and then we'll hear your answers, and then we'll have a discussion maybe, and we'll move on. The first one, Secretary Austin, when he was in Korea last week, he said that the U.S. stands ready to use all means at its disposal, not just conventional, but nuclear means to defend South Korea. And this is not the first time the U.S. government officials say that. But now, if you put it in the context of what the United States has been saying to the Russian government and the Ukrainian theater, don't you dare, to use nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons on the Ukrainian field to accomplish your military objectives. There is quite a difference here. So please explain to us, why is it okay for the United States to use nuclear weapons to deter North Korea, and it's not okay, let's say, for other governments like Russian government to use nuclear weapons? I'm not saying they're going to, they're not maybe even contemplating, but in terms of logic here, what's the logic and what are the implications of that? If we're saying it's fine if we do it, but don't you dare, you do it. I mean, I understand we're good guys, they're bad guys, but beyond that, that's number one. And number two, we know President Yoon made a couple of comments, a few comments recently, implying that he may be willing to think about developing a South Korean nuclear deterrent out of fear that maybe the credibility of the U.S. nuclear deterrence is not as strong as many people expect. And 7 out of 10 South Koreans, actually, they said we would support him. If his government takes South Korea nuclear down that path, we will support him. So if you could please put it in the context for us, historical context, that's not the first time they're talking about it, technical context, can they do it or not, and geopolitical context, what it will mean for the regional balance of forces, for the future of the US-ROC alliance. I mean, will it break the US-ROC alliance if the South Koreans were to go that way? So I'll be very curious to hear your answers to these two questions. Thank you.
So, Alexandre, thank you very much for those great questions. And so, though I'm going to respond to something you said before the questions, though, first, and then I'll answer the two questions. And so, you used the word complacency several times, and I wanted to draw a fine distinction. Is that I do see biases, and then I do see in some quarters, even something that might be described as complacency. But in general, I do actually see a certain degree of urgency and a certain degree of interest in shoring up deterrence. But what I don't see is actually stepping back and thinking about more fundamental changes in the nature of the deterrence challenges that we face and how we're going to address those. And so to me, it's this sense of immediate urgency that is crowding out a more strategic relook and reorientation. That's the issue, not so much that there is truly complacency in every quarter. And I really have been impressed by the efforts of the United States and the ROK and things like Secretary Austin's visit and some of the military activities to show that we're taking deterrence more seriously as an alliance. But I worry that we are focused too much on the ways that have worked in the past instead of thinking about what's going to work in the future based on the changing nature of this threat. And happy to talk about that more, but really the potential for a limited nuclear strike and the potential for simultaneity with both North Korea and China are things that I don't think we've really fully come to grips with how to explain how we're going to deal with these possibilities. And to be frank, we're sort of not really talking about those challenges as the primary ones. We're talking in these very large scale terms about a full scale conflict and focusing on North Korea rather than on the fact that China is a big factor here in deterrence in East Asia as well. So I'll say that in the beginning. Now, to your point about the Russian nuclear use potential in Ukraine, as opposed to Secretary Austin and others saying, hey, all options are on the table in terms of responding to North Korean aggression. I'd like to make the point very clearly that these are two different circumstances, not just because of the moral difference between Washington and Moscow, as you alluded, and I think that's perhaps the most obvious element. But also, we're talking about a place where, at least in my view and the view of most of us, I would argue, outside of those who are in the Russian leadership, is that this was a war of choice for Russia to invade Ukraine, and the leveraging of nuclear threats, coercion, and then potential nuclear use to achieve those goals is something that Russia is doing to double down on a choice that they made to conduct an act of aggression if they were to do those things. Conversely, it's very clear that if the U.S. is explaining the potential for use of all options, this is in the context right now of responding to a North Korean attack. It is a defensive use, not an offensive use. I think that's the fundamental difference, right? And I know that Moscow has tried to catch its invasion of Ukraine as a defensive one, but really that's not the reality, right? So I think that's the fundamental distinction, in answer to your first question. And I'll admit, Alexandre, I focus so much, on trying to see these things from the perspective of the U.S., and its allies, and from the perspective of Beijing and the perspective of Pyongyang. And I'll admit, Moscow is probably the player in all of these that I've examined the least. And so I'm not sure if I'm the best one to sort of answer that question. On the second point about the potential for South Korea to develop its own nuclear capabilities, and the fact that President Yoon has been so very public about that. I think that's the clear distinction here. When we talk about a history in which it's well established that the ROK had embarked upon the path of developing its own nuclear weapons in the past, and was essentially moved away from that path, by the United States, and the U.S. Approached this as a very serious issue, right, and did quite a lot to convince the South Korean government of the time not to go down this path, right? And so the difference here is that conversely, rather than trying to develop a nuclear weapon somewhat in secret, President Yoon is doing the opposite, right? Is that South Korea is not going down a path of a covert nuclear weapons program, at least not that I'm aware of. And I really don't think that's something that would comport with the Republic of Korea, the democracy today that I know. I don't buy it. But President Yoon's very public statements about the potential that the ROK could go down this path and the need for those things, I think it's a very different approach in a very different context, even if they both touch on the same issue of the ROK having nuclear weapons. The approaches are fundamentally different, as I would argue the Republic of Korea government is very different now that you have a full-fledged mature democracy, and you have a relationship with the United States, which I would argue it has evolved quite a bit. Since the days under Park Chung-hee, where ROK covert nuclear weapons program was part of the equation, and so contextually, I think there's a number of different variables here. Is that President Yoon's audience is not just any one particular subset. There's a number of audiences for this. Of course, the North Koreans themselves, I think, are part of the audience of the North Koreans, helping them to understand that the path that they're going down is not going to go unchecked, and that the ROK is going to continue to reinforce its efforts to the point of even considering having its own nuclear weapons. It's also a message to Washington that the ROK's concerns about nuclear deterrence need to be taken very seriously, or else the ROK may take steps that would go far beyond what the United States would want. But then also there's a very significant domestic component. I think there's a response to the fact that there's a lot of polling to indicate there's as you alluded before, there's majority support among South Koreans for South Korea having its own nuclear capability. Now, I think when you really unpack how that would come about and what it would mean for the ROK's economic situation and alliance relationships, then enthusiasm gets tempered. But the fact of the matter is that there is a real question in the South Korean public in many quarters of why don't we have our own capabilities, where we are a nation that has wealth, that has a robust conventional military. Why don't we also have nuclear weapons? If the goal is, as I think the ROK has been very clear, to have a greater degree of self-reliance for its own defense, then why not consider nuclear weapons as part of that self-reliance? I think that's part of the argument that the ROK is making domestically. But I think there's another, or I'm sorry, that President Yoon is making domestically. But I think there's another element here that we haven't really come to grips with. Is I think part of the message is also to Beijing, right? And I can't be sure. I haven't had a conversation with President Yoon about why he's seeing these things, right? But what I can say is that a nuclear armed Republic of Korea, the fact that that's even a possibility should be a real shot across the bow to Beijing to say your continued tolerance of North Korea's nuclear development and weapons testing, and your continued backing for this regime, and your unwillingness to enforce sanctions, and your constant efforts to essentially deflect from North Korea and play its defense lawyer at the UN, that there are consequences to this that are strategic. So I think that there is an implicit message to Beijing, essentially, that you need to change your policy toward North Korea to get them off of this path, or else South Korea is going to be compelled to develop its own capabilities. Now, how this all unfolds, I think, will be affected by what North Korea does, certainly by the United States and its conversations with Seoul, the domestic political environment in South Korea, but then also by what Beijing's reaction is to this, and Beijing's approaches to North Korea and how that changes. But what I would say is right now you're not seeing a real sort of public strong reaction from Beijing to this discussion in the same way you saw the reaction to say the decision to deploy a THAAD battery to the Republic of Korea. And so I'll be interested to see as this unfolds how much it really seizes attention in Beijing and causes them to really rethink the pathway that things are headed on, that they've been essentially aiding and abetting, particularly in recent years, of North Korea's continued development, which again is the root reason why this conversation is going on in the Republic of Korea. But I think it's also important to keep in mind, as some of this polling data, Beijing is also a factor in why some of the South Koreans polled, a lot of South Koreans polled, think that they need to have their own nuclear capability, because some very good polling suggests that over the long term, many South Koreans see China rather than North Korea is going to be the primary security threat to the Republic of Korea. And many of the South Koreans polled who were who about the justification for why South Korea needs nuclear weapons did not cite North Korea as the number one reason. That there's other.
So Markus, could I jump into this conversation,
yeah.
Markus, if I may? Let me sort of pivot on what you just said about China initially and what you're just saying about China right now. I think we've seen from China's actions in the past. Certainly, they hosted the six-party talks, and we saw where Wang Yi, their former foreign minister, now the member of the Politburo, headed those. Convened the six-party talks to get North Korea to come to the table and to talk about complete verifiable denuclearization. And this is what we're asking China to do now, to get North Korea to come back to the table to talk about complete verifiable denuclearization in return for security assurances and a path to normal relations, but complete verifiable denuclearization. That's not happening. And you mentioned in your opening comments, a lot of that is not happening with China sort of getting involved in trying to convince and use his leverage with North Korea to come to the table, most likely because of the tension between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Well, we have Secretary of State Blinken going to be visiting with China next week. And obviously, North Korea is going to be part of this conversation, as will Taiwan, no question about that. And as you just indicated now, it's not in China's interest to see South Korea and others, possibly Japan, go nuclear. And it's not in China's interest to see conflict on the Korean Peninsula and in the region. I mean, we're talking about China now that's just come out of zero COVID. China now that's looking at possibly 5% GDP growth. But the projection was about 2.3% GDP growth. China has a number of demographic issues, economic issues, and this is confronting Xi Jinping, and certainly Taiwan is in the forefront. And he's heard from President Biden that the U.S. is there. If China uses kinetic means to resolve issues, attempt to resolve issues with Taiwan, the United States is there to help defend Taiwan, because Taiwan, pursuant to the Taiwan Relations Act, regardless of the joint communiques, we agree that there's one China and not two Chinas and not a Taiwan and a China, but it should be resolved peacefully. The resolution should be peaceful. So if Xi Jinping has all these issues on the table, to see North Korea escalate and possibly get the United States to be involved with the Republic of Korea because of our allied commitments, correct commitments to the Republic of Korea, because we're there for the Republic of Korea. I would think it would be China telling Taiwan, strike that, telling the DPRK, cease and desist, come back to negotiations. This is where you want to be. And possibly that's why we haven't seen the seventh nuclear test, because it's not in China's interest to see all these things going on. So my question to you, really, Markus, is given the issues with Taiwan, given the tension and now the commitment that the U.S. has certainly with the Republic of Korea on enhanced deterrence, and maybe even looking at enhancing, if you will, a missile defense, a second THAAD system. The same for Japan. And indeed, I haven't even mentioned the South China Sea, where we see all these issues now, where the countries are coming together, whether it's Malaysia, Indonesia, and indeed the Philippines, committing to 4 additional bases, where people are coming to, these countries are coming together and saying, what is China doing? And where China has the wolf warrior mentality and that policy has backfired. Because countries are saying enough with China. Cease and desist with this aggressive approach, this assertive approach. So if I were advising Xi Jinping, I would say, focus on relations with the United States, focus on relations with ASEAN, and resolve some of these issues in the South China Sea, and certainly with the European Union, and get things in place with Russia and the war in Ukraine, and maybe a peaceful intercession there, where we're talking about trying to peacefully resolve issues with the war in Ukraine. So my question to you is, would this not be on the forefront of Secretary Blinken's agenda with China? And would it not be in China's interest to see a de-escalation rather than an escalation? And ergo, would it not be in China's interest, we don't have to convince them, to tell North Korea, do not escalate. Do not even think about using tactical nuclear weapons, because it's certainly not in China's interest. What do you think, Markus?
Yeah, so number one, let me say I wish Xi Jinping looked to you as a trusted advisor, and maybe China would be behaving more responsibly and doing more to help the situation in East Asia and in the world. And I think that the fundamental problem is that China sees its own interests differently than in many ways than we would like them to see those interests, and that the tendency to see things very zero sum with the United States, number one, and then also I think the way that they see the North Korea problem is not inherently that North Korea itself, is possessing nuclear weapons is the problem. It is the potential for conflict on the Korean Peninsula, the potential for North Korea's possession and use of nuclear weapons to drive reactions by the United States and the Republic of Korea, including, of course, the ROK, even developing its own nuclear weapons. That is essentially the reason why it matters the most for Beijing's security. I don't think there's any fears in Beijing that Pyongyang is going to, use those nuclear weapons against, China peremptorily or something like that. It's basically that North Korea's behavior drives reactions in the region that are unhelpful to it. But the problem is that rather than thinking that the focus is on restraining North Korea or changing North Korea's calculus, the Chinese seem to have kind of given up on trying to get North Korea to really in the near term take any serious steps toward nuclearization, and they're really focusing on more trying to push back against the United States and even to some extent against the Republic of Korea and other U.S. allies and their measures vis-a-vis North Korea. And so essentially, rather than trying to cure the disease, they're focused on treating the symptoms. And the core problem is the nature of the North Korean regime that drives its desire for nuclear weapons, that drives its aggressive behavior. And so Beijing, I think, is more focused on trying to minimize the negative effects of that development on
Markus. Markus, may I ask you a question of clarification? Just 5 seconds. Did I understand you correctly that you said it's okay for a mature democracy, an ally of the United States, if it does it in a public way and it's supported by its people, to actually have a nuclear weapons program? And if that's what you're saying, then what does it do to the U.S. nuclear deterrence, to the non-proliferation regime, to strategic arms control talks all around the world? Or am I wrong? Am I misinterpreting what you said to me earlier?
Yeah, so that's not what I said. What I said was that it was initiating a public conversation about nuclear weapons is not the same thing as pursuing a covert nuclear program, right? What we have seen from President Yoon is not a statement of we are developing nuclear weapons. It's not the development of nuclear weapons in a covert way. It's opening a conversation to make it clear that the ROK,
But they're opening a window of overtone. You start the conversation first. You do it publicly. Is it a good justification? I'm surprised that there is no pushback in the United States to what Yoon said, to be honest, because it goes against, decades-long U.S. non-proliferation policy. And yet, you're looking the other way. We're being complacent and losing vigilance.
So Alexander, could we give Markus a minute to respond, and then I want to sort of bring it to close.
Oh, that's it. I have nothing else to say.
So Markus, go right ahead.
You didn't have to interrupt me.
Yeah, so I think to be clear, I think there's a better set of solutions than South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons, right? But at the same time, I also think, despite the fact that this, in your phrase, would move the Overton window about allies thinking about developing their own nuclear capabilities, I think it's disingenuous and frankly, problematic. To tolerate the complete progress, that North Korea has made, and the rhetoric and all these other things, and not take seriously the fact that the U.S. ally is so frustrated and so concerned by this development that they're thinking about things that were previously unthinkable and wanting to engage in that dialogue. And ultimately, I think that the alliance will be able to find solutions to address the concerns of the ROK vis-a-vis North Korea and China without having to develop its own nuclear weapons. But peremptorily shutting down that conversation, I think, basically, takes us down a path where we're essentially giving North Korea a much more favorable hearing than the Republic of Korea, and that is not a good way to maintain the alliance, and nor is appropriate in the context of international norms. And so, until and unless that there's some fundamental change in North Korea, there has to be. In terms of its path in nuclear weapons development, there has to be a clear acknowledgement of the fact that North Korea has gone far, far beyond what is acceptable to the international community, and it has to be dealt with accordingly. And China's, in particular, continuing tolerance of North Korea's nuclear program, I think that's moved the Overton window, frankly, Alexander, much more than
Markus, if I may interrupt, Markus, because we're coming to the closing hour. This has been a very, very excellent discussion. Let me just say this, from my vantage point, I think we see this with the Austin visit, Secretary of Defense Austin's visit these past few days with South Korea. We are all concerned with North Korea's escalation and what they've done with over 100 missile launches and what they're doing with building more nuclear weapons. Plutonium-based, highly enriched uranium-based. I think there's concern, real concern. And that's part of the discussion about enhancing deterrence. And this is where we're going, because South Korea going towards nuclear weapons. And we're talking about the likelihood of a nuclear arms race in the region. We're talking about proliferation, not only for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the economic effects on South Korea itself, because it would affect them economically, their relations with the European Union and others, but also with the nuclear supplier group, with their own programs too for civilian nuclear energy. So there's so many reasons why South Korea should not go nuclear, but we should enhance the deterrence, and we should get China more involved in getting North Korea to stop this escalation. And hopefully this is the Secretary of State Blinken's visit with China will move us further in that direction, as was the conversation a few months ago between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. Hopefully we move from the Bali to the Beijing discussions with Blinken and his counterpart, to include Wang Yi, who's so intimate with this issue, so that we can start seeing some progress. Because North Korea, and we started this conversation by saying North Korea has responded to the Austin visit by saying the U.S. is crossed an extreme red line, and they would use overwhelming nuclear force. That lends itself to what you've been saying, Marcus, during this conversation here. This is where we have to get North Korea to de-escalate and to move in a different direction. And China is so central to it. Look, we can continue this discussion for some time. I think it's great that we have Marcus on the program, but also the work you're doing with the Atlantic Council. We'll be hearing so much from you and your colleagues and reading the material you put out. And we will be inviting you back here because this is the conversation we need, Marcus. And we thank you for your excellent work on North Korea and trying to resolve these issues on the Korean Peninsula, but beyond that, in the East, the Northeast Asia and the East Asian region and globally. So thank you to you, Marcus. And Alexander, always thank you to you. And Michael, thank you to the Washington Times Foundation for permitting us to have such a rich dialogue.
Thank you, Ambassador. Another wonderful program, so informative. And we want to give special thanks to Mr. Markus Garlauskas. Excellent insights and understanding, so current. We do really want to seek denuclearization. I'm so grateful for Ambassador DeTrani to never, ever back off of that goal. It is the only goal that we see at the Washington Times Foundation that really is the one we must pursue. Thank you, Dr. Mansourov. Always your current understanding is so insightful. I want to thank the Washington Times, which will be covering this program, which also has been very good at generating a lot of reciprocation from the media in Korea and Seoul, especially. We're very happy with that. And Universal Peace Federation, thank you for also helping to sponsor this program along with the Washington Times Foundation. So we look forward to you. We're here the first Tuesday of every month. And thank you all for a wonderful and important program.